Welcome everybody. My name's Matt Ward. I'm the owner of this bookshop and a business called Euro Publications. We're a specialist architecture and design publisher. Sadly didn't publish this book, but very happy to have these guys here tonight to do the official Australian launch. Before we begin, I'd like to start by acknowledging that this bookshop sits on Wurundjeri land, and I'd like to extend my respect to their ancestors and elders past and present. We've convened tonight's event as a local launch of sorts for Supertight, Models for Living and Making Culture in Dense Urban Environments. I understand there has been an Asian launch, which is probably appropriate because most of the case studies in the book are focused on that part of the world. It's a book that explores both the delight and the difficulty that emerges through close occupation in big cities. It's a pleasure to be joined tonight by both of the book's editors, Crist and John Doyle. Graham is an Associate Professor of Architecture at RMIT University in the School of Architecture and Urban Design and a founding director of Melbourne-based architecture practice Antarctica. John is a Senior Lecturer in the Architecture and Urban Design programs at RMIT University, Program Manager and Head of the Master of Architecture program and President of the Association of Architecture Schools of Australasia.
And Associate Dean now.
And Associate Dean.
Since that was written.
God, I can't keep up. That was a mouthful enough, to be honest. He's also a practicing architect and a director of Common. So the plan for tonight is obviously this is a super tight space, so it's pretty informal. The guys are going to present a little bit of the book, we're going to have a chat, and then we'll probably just throw it out to the crowd. Just so you know, we are actually filming tonight, so that's focused on the front. If you're up the front here, you'll be captured, so keep that in mind. There's also obviously an audio recording, but you won't necessarily be identifiable as long as you're not standing right here. Yeah, great. So I'll throw it to you guys. John, do you want to kick it off?
Sure. I mean, probably, first we should say we are keen on a conversation and for this to be as informal as possible. If you thought you were coming for a lecture, you might be a little disappointed. And I think that's appropriate. The book is very much framed as a conversation that really started about density in cities generally, but it was built through a conversation or a set of conversations in an exhibition at the RMIT Design Hub in 2019. So the projects that we've focused on here that you see and you can see in the book were exhibited at that show, and while the exhibition was open every week, we would gather in the tight bar inside the gallery. There's a drawing of the exhibition. And so at the end of the bigger hall, there was a little installation of a bar. We would meet there and we would chew the fat on the various issues of cities and so on. And a lot of the content grew out of that and helped sort of clarify for us. And of course, the stuff in this book grows out of conversations that John and I have been having for many years, particularly around Asian cities and how much we love Japan and Vietnam and Hong Kong and Shanghai and places like that. And the conversations that were going around Melbourne quite intensely as the core of Melbourne densified. There was a bit of anxiety about that, it was mixed opinions, and there was a moment when Rob Adams talked about, what good density is versus undesirable density, and he said, Barcelona good, Hong Kong bad. Almost as blunt as that. And we sort of looked at each other and went, why is Hong Kong not more useful at least to learn about than Barcelona? So that was one of the things that sort of kicked off our interest, and just to sort of naturally being drawn to those cities that we kind of enjoy being in and experiencing. And also then it triggers a conversation about density, which is less about crunching the numbers and seeing how big an apartment is and how many people per square kilometre and so on, but the sort of the qualities that living close together engenders and how it can be actually more desirable. And again, to try and counter the argument that, density is something we need, but we don't want too much of it because we don't like it. Maybe more is better in that respect.
Yeah, I mean, so what we've got here is a series of pages from the book. So we've sort of pulled these out to talk to them. This is a photo of the exhibition that was held in 2019, and so as Graham was saying, we launched this project as a way of perhaps working back from, from a series of projects that we'd done. I'd lived in Japan to complete my master's degree for a few years, and Graham was the head of the briefly existent RMIT Architecture Vietnam degree, which lasted for a little while. And both of we from 2006 through to 2019 had undertaken design studios with students and researchers from RMIT in Japan, China, Hong Kong, obviously, Vietnam, and through numerous cities throughout the region. And so we, in the context of the conversations around density, we looked across all of this work and all of these projects, and we arrived at the term supertight as perhaps as a way of describing the quality of many of the conditions that we not only the conditions we saw, but the responses that our students and colleagues that we know in the region have been developing through their design and creative practices. And so in terms of this idea about how do we describe design density differently, so the supertight is not density. It might exist alongside density or in dense urban conditions, and it became about perhaps best defined by describing urban environments and architectures and design practices or projects that reconcile a city with its level of density. So spaces that have adapted to density, whatever that may be, at whatever level, to make maximum use of space, or to make the best use of space. We also describe the supertight as being a kind of social condition or a behavioural condition in which people have, in tight or dense urban environments, have developed ways of living in cities that are very, very sort of accustomed or kind of habituated to high levels of, or to close living. And so the book and the exhibition was about kind of not only, I guess, celebrating that through examples, but also trying to understand how that might become a model. Something that's useful and that can be applied in future architecture. So the exhibition involved a series of built installations, which you can see on the screen, and then a series of very large scale projections. We had back and forth, but we had very large drawings produced at 1:1 by some architects and researchers in Japan called Shiozaki Laboratory, and these drawings were of depicting everyday scenes of density and sort of social practice in Japan, and I guess through this series of through the projects and through these installations, we were trying to, I guess, model at 1:1 at the scale of human inhabitation what it means to live well closely, to be super tight, and perhaps how we might kind of understand and what it might be like to occupy that. So I guess the book then became a kind of compendium of these projects, such as this project by Shiozaki Lab, but also a series of other contributions by architects and designers throughout the region, and a series of conversations that we had with them. So you might pass this around actually. These are copies that we thumbed through quite a bit. They're our copies, so these are not for sale. But a series of the book became a series of interviews with practitioners in Asia, practitioners in Melbourne, people from the development sector, people from local government, students, other academics.
Yeah, it's important to say that not all those designers were architects or urbanists. So Desiree Grunwald is an illustrator working in Vietnam and would do some amazing collages of the urban environment. Some of which become really abstract, I guess, like this one, and others are, you have to do a double take to realise is that a photograph or a kind of a elided collage. Andy Stiff has also been in Vietnam for years, making amazing videos of this scene. So there's a sort of part of the sort of qualitative thing is that talk about the fictionalising of places, or that kind of desirability of a place that is, you know, built around those kind of closed urban environments.
Yeah. I mean, one of the, there's also sort of more traditional architectural projects, such as the work of Japanese architect Daisuke Sanuki, who's based in Ho Chi Minh City and does these kind of fantastic projects in what are called the hems. So the hem is the Vietnamese word for laneway, or the South Vietnamese word for laneway. And these projects, which are kind of, you know, on the one hand, exceptional in terms of their material and kind of architectural design quality, but what they do well that's perhaps sort of our interest is that they negotiate this environment in such a way as to allow these conditions to exist. And it's sort of, they look effortless in terms of the final project and sort of final outcome. They look like beautiful places to live, but it is through that kind of process of negotiation, adaptation, editing of the urban environment that these things are able to happen. A number of the contributions, scan back to, were from architects based in cities who produced films. So this is a speculative film by a really fantastic, I guess you would say Dutch-Chinese practice. The practice based in Beijing, who have a partner who is Chinese and one or two from the Netherlands, and they produced a film about this installation that they did in a neighbourhood in Beijing, and looking at the idea that even, you know, within a very loose city, like which Beijing can be, I mean, it's obviously got a lot of people, but it's quite spread out, that there's ways to create kind of a sense of, I guess we would describe, they call it spacious tightness, a tightening or kind of activation of the courtyards through these kinds of installations, and that's been something that they've carried forth into their own, some other of their design projects. And then this fantastic film series that was contributed by a really exciting emerging practice from Hong Kong called New Office Works, so we knew them just through the fact one of them is an RMIT alumnus, but they sort of rose to prominence in Hong Kong through winning a competition at the same time as producing a film series about that sort of accompanied their competition-winning entry for the pavilion. And so they've put out this series of films which they included in the exhibition, which look at different aspects of life in Hong Kong, called the Middleman series. And each one of these looks at a different aspect of the material culture of the city and how it's adapted to density and adapted to its position in the sort of global scheme of things through architecture, through urban design, and through sort of urban negotiations.
Yeah, so I was just thinking about what John was saying, that there's a view that grows out of all those conversations and the projects and then the book that this is less about designing cities per se, and definitely not about planning them, but more about how we can inhabit them in an intelligent way. So I guess it's kind of bottom up in that respect, but it really is. We often describe tightness as an adaptation to density. In other words, how do people learn to live in a delightful way in a dense environment? And so even if these people are designers of the built environment, the focus is on observing how people inhabit space and use it in a particularly good way.
So an example of that is Toru Horiguchi lab in Osaka. They produced a film about this standing bar in Osaka, which is like a bar that sits right next to a train station that becomes incredibly dense and full at a certain time of the day, and then at other times it's basically a room full of tables. And their film documents the way in which the setting of furniture and the arranging of the space very, very simply allows for it to sort of expand and contract. And it's just really about some very simple kind of moves within a space that allow these things to happen. So maybe so the book it's a collection of these projects. It's sort of accompanied by this series of interviews in which we talk to the contributors and others about their ideas and to try and tease out propositions. But through all of those and sort of interspersed between these are a series of essays. And so the exhibition, I think as Graham suggested, it became almost a form of live research. So we gathered, we came up with this concept of the Supertight. We put it to our network, we put it to the city. We solicited a series of contributions in forms of films. We built an installation, and then we sat in it and talked about density for 8 weeks. And what came out?
Not constantly.
Not constantly. It was
once a week.
Yep. It was probably the least dense part of the city at some points. Actually, with 3 people in the conversation. But what we emerged out of that was a series of 6 ideas about city, the Supertight, or the urban density. And so then, what we I guess maybe the contribution of the book is really. I'll get to the contents page is really a series of taking all of these ideas and the sort of the learnings from these conversations in this very dispersed series of projects, and then synthesizing them into 6 propositions about cities. We probably won't go into them because they can be a little bit.
Yeah, well, maybe we can talk about it through conversation, but
probably, yeah.
In some ways we sort of extracted those conversations into a series of 6 thematic essays, which overlap with each other, but try and sort of pull the thing apart. And we sort of, I guess, kind of tease out particular foci of the work as we go. What sort of, I think, is also common about, just sort of continuing that little conversation about the inhabiting or the behaviour in cities rather than the design or the planning of them, is that so much of the conversation when we get into anything to do with density and particularly in kind of cities like this is how do we control them, how do we plan them, how do we either contain the density or put limits on it and so on. I guess we were more and more coming to the view that it's about letting density happen, letting cities kind of do their thing, because there's mountains and mountains of collective intelligence in them that goes far beyond what an urban planner can do, and to the extent that urban planning as a discipline is really built to kind of prevent so much of what we love in this book from happening. That it's built to actually control the kind of mess of the city, and for good reason in the 18th and 19th century. But those reasons have become sort of self-fulfilling now. So I guess it's ironically there's a sort of a conversation about tightness and looseness, where loose cultures are very good at permitting things to happen and being less disciplined and less controlling of them. And that there's that whole sort of history of thinking of density as being about repetition and about a kind of an oppressive sameness that we were trying to kind of unravel a bit as well.
Yeah. The context of when, maybe just to finish, was that, and fortunately we're no longer in the sort of grip of it, but COVID was present when we were writing the book, particularly thinking through, we sort of had all the material and we were ready to start writing, and then suddenly it was about March 2020 when we were really getting into the swing of things, and then there was a period there where we really were sort of gripped with anxiety about, well, what does this mean? Is this the end of our career?
End of our lives.
Yeah. Well, yeah. But I mean, one of the interesting things that sort of, and there's an essay here with Yoshi Tsukamoto, who's a really fantastic architect from Japan, who is a sort of an icon of kind of I would say Japanese architecture now, and we had a conversation with him, which forms the introduction of the book, really about the concept of the Supertight in light of COVID and sort of the experience of COVID in Japan, and perhaps the idea of that in some ways what it reinforced the experience of COVID was that there are forms of density. There are obviously forms of density which are undesirable. Anyone who's been to an airport would understand that. But there are forms of density which are incredibly desirable, and those were the most obviously, that we lost those most obviously during COVID. The idea of social distancing, we lost the capacity to be close to people in these kinds of settings. We couldn't do this, and you know, in that, you know, obviously that was taken up by, there was a sort of a density that sort of emerged in lieu of that through digital technologies and Zoom and whatnot. But the kind of I guess the gregarious or the kind of the incidental nature of human exchange was kind of set aside during that period. And so, and perhaps so to conclude, the takeaway from the book really is about thinking how do we amplify those qualities of cities which are, you know, are desirable, those forms of density which we would want under any circumstance, you know, and make that the sort of the departure point for architecture and urban design. And ultimately, if we are going to have to live smaller and to reduce the carbon footprint of cities, which they contribute about 3/4 or 2/3 of the world's sort of, you know, carbon output, then, you know, how might we leverage the opportunity of desirable density as a kind of driver of change in that space?
Brilliant.
Thank you.
I think the COVID thing I was telling you about that is how quickly everybody's come back.
Yes.
So, you know, obviously that densification is highly desirable to people. It's a powerful motivator.
It is. I mean, I think the interesting thing, I was just talking today about the city and the fact that there's still, we have and we haven't. I mean, there has been certain types of things that have come back, but we're still not quite, like offices, for example, haven't quite, you know, sort of fully reappeared in the way that they were before to the density levels, the numerical density levels that they were before. So again, it comes down to that idea about how do you cultivate a culture of that makes being present desirable. You know, what is it about? Clearly, like in terms of like international student populations have returned in huge numbers to the centre of Melbourne, for example. So there is something incredibly desirable and sellable about that condition or that process. But maybe, you know, sitting in a fluorescent meeting room at 9 o'clock on a Monday morning isn't quite there yet. So, you know,
not so desirable,
and also not as dense as we think. I mean, you know, that sort of disjunction between dense habitation and high-rise towers is something that comes out of this as well.
Yeah.
Actually, sorry, you got me wrong now. But the whole work from home thing actually is another unexpected form of density, because so what we've sort of inadvertently done there is compress the footprint of the city down, like by removing like 50% of the space that people use in their daily life and somehow making it acceptable to work from your desk. We've removed, there's a whole chunk of the city that's now somehow become redundant.
Yeah.
It's not dense because nobody's found something else to do with it yet, but like arguably just through the process of COVID, there's a chunk of the city that could be discarded or kind of reused for something else.
Yeah, reused.
Aquaponics.
Aquaponics, yeah.
Yeah. Well, parkland obviously would be wonderful. Just on that point, what you guys didn't quite say this explicitly, so I'm just going to put the question. What is it about, say, for example, Ho Chi Minh or Hong Kong that you like better than, say, for example, Barcelona or Amsterdam?
We shouldn't say we don't like Europe.
Can I answer that question as well? Like Rob Adams, what you think he was thinking?
I think
it's
it's
really cosmetic, or
no. I think it's quite clear. I think he's genuinely trying to promote and successfully promoting the reconsolidation of the city. And in order to make that argument palatable, he's going, it doesn't have to look like that, which is scary. This is a really palatable version of density. You all love Paris and you all love Barcelona. They're the two of the most dense cities in the world. I think that's what it's about. And I guess you could say, well, maybe Hong Kong's a bit harder to love, but we've found a way. Maybe Ho Chi Minh City's not as beautiful as Barcelona, but it's got some absolutely stunning quality. So it's not saying one's better than the other. We can't take it for granted those cities are gorgeous.
Yep.
We don't need to promote them.
Yep. They promote themselves.
Well, I mean, the other thing is that everybody, it's nice to go and look at something different. I mean, not that people haven't looked at Hong Kong or Ho Chi Minh City or Japan, but it does seem to be a consensus around Barcelona that doesn't really need reaffirming, do you know what I mean? So,
an easy sell.
Yeah.
But there is also something about those cities that I think we enjoy. So the way people use the street in Saigon is really, really intense in a way that's been kind of cleaned up in Australian cities and in European cities as well. So there's a part of what makes that city so lively for anyone who's been there, and a lot of other cities in the region, is the really, really intense use of public space. There are mind-blowing numbers of micro enterprises in Vietnam, and that's what makes the economy work as well. So all that, street food culture and sort of street trading culture.
That's interesting, because the densification here in terms of planning is about accessibility and affordability, like getting more accommodation to more people. That's the sell. But that compression, you would hope, would also allow mechanics to be in there, as well as the little bars, little pokey things.
All
that's the beauty.
That's right. And a lot of it is very unregulated, and it runs up against government policy sometimes. But where it's at its best, that it's just allowed to happen in a fairly unregulated way.
It's also extremely precarious, though, isn't it? I mean, that's the argument that you see in Planet of Slums, for example. It's that informal sector is a kind of necessity for these people, and not necessarily something that's desirable.
So yeah, that's an interesting thing to compare it to a slum informal settlement too, because it's something not like that as well. I mean, in the middle of District 1 of Ho Chi Minh City, by the way, we sort of flip and flop between Saigon and Ho Chi Minh City, and we can work out which is the correct one, but we often call it Saigon. It's, you can be in quite affluent streets and this stuff is still happening. So it's not something that gets eradicated solely out of gentrification, which is really great, except when then you get to the newer development where it's all high-rise, and then it finds it harder to survive.
Well, I mean, the interesting thing about, so the informality in District 1, or the inner districts of Ho Chi Minh City, and probably Hanoi, although I don't really know much about it, but there's a huge capital investment in terms to make something which is still quite informal, which is perhaps why the model is interesting, because we're talking about 6-7 story buildings here. It's not, Dar es Salaam or something like that, which could disappear in an instant.
There's not blue tarps.
No, it needs to, and we actually have a PhD student at RMIT now he's a practicing architect from Ho Chi Minh City. He's just moved to Melbourne actually, but he talks, part of what he's doing in his PhD is talking about the intricate processes of negotiation that have to happen in order for a lot of these buildings to happen. So the idea, there's lots of, most of it isn't above board. There's lots of kickbacks, and you build this and then it gets pulled down and replaced by something. But there is a kind of, there is a process that needs to be, and a kind of practice that needs to be understood and can be documented, but and it's not entirely legal, but it is nevertheless, understood, I guess.
So it's not necessarily an absence of planning; it's a lack of enforcement or a subversion of those planning regulations.
It's an unplanned planning.
Yeah.
It's not something that's it sort of exists as an agreement amongst a group of people that seems to be sort of what's the word, like.
I mean, part of it is, I think, seeing that whether someone sells food on the street is not the role of the urban planner to decide. There are obviously planners in Ho Chi Minh City who don't put that, and there are occasionally efforts to remove all that stuff. But generally, it's not the role to regulate that. So we're obsessed with a market-based economy and hate regulation of the economy for the most part, because we're all grown up into neoliberalism, but we want to regulate the built environment for some reason.
It's just a matter of numbers, though. Like if you take this amount of people and they're now living that closer together, and there's in that space, then there's certain things they want access to other than residential requirements. Or do they just go to the mall? Is that you've got the dense urban, the living environment, and then the mall? You don't regulate, or at least say that that's one of the benefits of Titans, I guess. It's compression of people and the things that go along with living.
Yeah. Where does the mall fit into that? I mean,
well, if you don't I'm not an advocate of regulating for those other things other than the domestic accommodation, like as you said, the bar, the food, the dentist, the other social services, whatever else you might have or need to have in close proximity.
Yeah.
If you don't regulate for it, it may not happen, and therefore you have this dense environment, and the only place to access it is outside that dense environment.
Right. Oh, yeah. Okay. That's an interesting point, and we're not necessarily advocating to say if it's a free fall, then you get the ideal city, because it's clearly there's plenty of evidence that that's not the case. But when it's working, if you're in a walkable or very dense environment, then you will have everything you need, because that's the nature of fulfilling needs when when urban markets are working properly.
Yeah.
I mean, there's also a great economy in these cities of moving around really efficiently as well. You can get just about anything delivered on a motorbike and all that sort of stuff, which is part of the adaptation.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the, if anything, what we argue for at a certain point is the idea that, so I mean, when we think, typically urban planning tends to associate land with one or a limited number of uses. I think one of the arguments for one of the ways in which we might be more dense, not necessarily through reducing the footprint of the city, is by just not having a single-use approach to land, basically reusing it for multiple different things. And so that's why the COVID experience kind of, in some ways, was proof of concept in one way. Mostly for like an information point of view. If you were working in an abattoir, for example, it's a bit tricky to work from home, but nevertheless, like the idea is that if we can adaptive reuse or the optimization spaces for multiple different functions and activities is a way to perhaps to facilitate that.
You've mentioned that we can't design for these qualities of tightness, but I can't help but ask the question, what would be the difference between a super dense building and a super tight building? Would they look different? Would they perform differently?
I don't think we say you can't design it. It's actually a really good.
We probably can design for it, but maybe not design.
Sort of
It's a very
undesign it.
subtle difference, but I think it's partly the role is to facilitate. We as designers in the built environment can allow this stuff to happen and not prevent it. We probably can't, control it for it, and that's part of what it is.
Somehow inject a little bit of anarchy.
Maybe that's partly what the difference is, just to sort of.
We don't say exactly how to do it necessarily, but in the appearance of the tight city, we sort of describe that there's a couple of techniques that you might use in order to kind of facilitate tightness. One of which is the idea that in order for a city to be tight, it needs to be editable, effectively. So there's the idea that you need to be able to adapt and make change easily. We call it, I think actually counterintuitively, the no-edit city, which is the idea that you can keep adding to it or kind of augment it and kind of adjust it, and the architecture keeps its inherent qualities. But I think perhaps the other sort of counterintuitive idea is that if you want a tight architecture is one which is planned loosely. So we look at I think these guys here are good examples. One is the Mauro Bracco's garden house, and I guess the idea there is it's a very small house. It's got quite a small footprint. Exists in in a kind of rural setting, but by allowing the freedom of the plan and the capacity to kind of adapt, change it, to open it up to the outside, makes it in terms of its possibilities much more than the kind of the footprint would suggest.
I'm getting a little Bob Strong elements here of what Rem Koolhaas has been arguing for decades around kind of productive congestion and free planning.
The culture of congestion, that's great, yeah. But also just thinking as we were you're asking the question in this room, it's like these things are intuitively so obvious to us. I mean, we are sitting in this little room and it's nice and comfortable, and it's nice being close to people, and
not too close.
This is a bookshop. It's not there's a lecture theatre. All these things. It's something we just do in a very straightforward way. There's a beautiful plant on the wall. And because the space is smaller, we care more about how it's fitted out. All that sort of stuff. If you maybe asked what the ideal size of this shop was, it'd be more than that on a spreadsheet.
Well, I have to say this is a product of necessity as well. A little bit like the informal settlements maybe in Asia. It's just tight budget.
Right. And that's kind of productive, because all urban environments are to some extent like that, because we can make a choice of living in a 300 square metre house or a 50 square metre apartment, and there's a lot of upside to the 50 square metre apartment because of all the proximity you get to things.
Mm-hmm.
But also a 50 square metre apartment, if it's done properly, can be it's a bit of a stretch, but feel more spacious. And there are houses that are planned, particularly in sort of the sort of spec home section of the market, which are without a space of sufficient size to allow something that could happen in a 50 square metre apartment. Again, chapter 1.
And the big spaces feel terrible. Yeah. The book is available for sale tonight, by the way, guys.
You sort of noted that this concept of Supertight sort of emerged as a result of necessity, but how does that sort of apply to Australia, where we're not constrained by space? We have the luxury of actually expanding out.
We are constrained by space. It's a complete myth that we have unlimited resources. Even though it's a big continent, cities are still cities, and we are really suffering from the sprawling boundary of Melbourne, just like any other city. So it's it's an excellent question, because that's what we're always confronted with. That obviously doesn't apply to us. That's Hong Kong. We don't live like that, etc., etc. But if that were the case, then why does the Beckett Street look like it does? There's a whole lot of other things going on other than sort of land use.
So the concept of necessity is pretty interesting as well, because that's relative to what someone's actually willing to sort of like live by. We all have different preferences for our peripersonal space. So people, in Hong Kong have a different threshold to where the average Australian may actually, it might be a further distance. So how do we sort of airdrop one concept from a place like Asia, where the cultural preference is much different from, where the preference in Australia is? Well,
it's a fair question, but we've had no problem airdropping European values into this continent, it seems. So there's that, but also it can change very quickly. I mean, I grew up in the suburbs, like nearly everybody did at a certain time, and my parents have profoundly different spatial maps of the world than I do, and that didn't take very long. So how I personally have adapted to urban life. It's amazing how quickly that happens. I mean, Ho Chi Minh City is a city full of people who are one generation from rural villages. So it's also not even necessarily about mega cities, that...
No.
I guess we're sort of arguing that people are inherently social and want to live together, even if they've got mechanisms to keep safe distance and all that sort of stuff at a psychological level. They still inherently want to gather, otherwise we wouldn't live in towns, villages, big cities and so on.
I mean, I keep banging on about the chapters, but one of the chapters is called Desire. I think it's Desire or Necessity. Maybe that was one version of the chapter title. I can't remember what it is now. But we're trying, in that essay, we try to decouple those cities from the circumstances in which they were created. So Hong Kong, Hong Kong is a curious one, because it's actually 70% park, green space. Its density is really, so we talk about scarcity. It's very, very dense, but the argument is always that it's kind of built on, it's mountainous, but then a lot of the buildings are built on the side of the hills. So anyway, but what we try to say is that there are actually qualities there that we might be desirable independently of the circumstances in which they were created. Like Barcelona, Paris, Barcelona, for example, was laid out in the 19th century as a way of bringing a very, very large workforce into a largely industrial city, and to have that workforce before mass transit nearby to to those employment sources. And the way that that was achievable was because you had a manufacturing economy which was pushing like land prices down and housing prices down in order to keep a workforce nearby. So the circumstances which made that city as dense as it is no longer exist. But it is one of the most desirable cities in the world to live. Like the people who live there can't even live there anymore. It's like one of the people. Like the Airbnb market is so hyperinflated that you can't. So it's again, it's that to Graham's point earlier. It's like saying, well, that density is desirable independently of its circumstances. What about some of these circumstances? What about some of these other conditions? And I think the Japanese city is particularly Tokyo is, I think quite a bit has been done to argue for the desirability of that place, but maybe not so much Hong Kong, maybe not so much Ho Chi Minh City. So it's about kind of saying, well, maybe there's something that we can. So I like the term airdrop here and test basically. The book is a speculation. It's a kind of
I guess the
other
thing to say to that, the interesting part of that conversation going the other way is that let's say Australians live one way and Vietnamese cities operate a different way, but there's a really strong pressure in those cities to westernise them in from a planning point of view.
Yeah.
So the density of Ho Chi Minh City is decreasing rapidly as Western urban planning values are taken there, and as Chevrolet sells a lot of SUVs.
That's what I was actually, I wanted to ask as well, because you mentioned in Vietnam how you had that student who's sort of looking at the complexities for planning sort of policies over there. Do you think that concepts like the Supertight will eventually sort of dissipate as these sort of countries emerge and industrialize and sort of move up that sort of like...
Certainly that's well, yeah. I mean, that maybe, probably, unfortunately. That's the trajectory of change in Vietnam at the moment. Other places...
It's not all one way though. I mean, it's fair to say that as people get more affluent, they take up more space and the density of their cities goes down. But there's this place called Manhattan that people with a lot of money like to live in. And there does seem to be evidence of a real desirability amongst young kids for that sort of really intense street life of District 1 and so on. So
just going to say
one or the other entirely.
One of the I'm going to steal the airdrop, by the way. That's definitely going to use that. I'll credit it. But the exhibition really was about kind of I pulled the slide up because. Again, we don't have it, but this little bar here was quite literally. I mean, it was modelled on a bar that I used to frequent in Tokyo. Like it's like the architect's bar. Like, it's actually called the Tight Bar. So probably a very idea. Like it's one of those things where you later on realise that you've stolen something, appropriated. But so we kind of built a model of that bar, like a full scale model of that bar in the exhibition, and the reason for that was because that bar in Tokyo, it's so ridiculously small. You have a staircase that's, it's a ladder, and there's 3 seats, and most of the people in the bar will stand over the staircase. And it was sort of, part of it was going, well, if we drop that concept into Australia, first of all, we can't build it because, it's illegal. The staircase had to be compliant, needed a handrail, had to have tactile indicators and all that, which I'm not complaining about because I think that buildings should be accessible. But the question was, does it still work? Is it still kind of viable as a proposition? And it did. It worked. Like the whole thing stood up. And so the lesson there was that yes, it can get slightly. The staircase can be less ridiculous. It can be open on the top because we couldn't build we needed to allow the sprinklers to be able to kind of spray into it and blah blah blah. But by creating that kind of platform, a bar, a couple of seats and a staircase, we could have a really intimate conversation. And it's in there. But I think there is some value in kind of transposing and kind of dropping things out of their context into other contexts to see if what makes them good in one place still has currency in another. I mean, I think it would be equally valid to drop the CERTA grid from Barcelona into Footscray, for example. In fact, Altona, I think ARM did a project through RMIT where they did exactly that, to say, what if we put, if we do this in Altona, will it still be good? And
which is to say, the history of design is full of airdropping, I guess.
Yeah.
And so let's just at least have a conversation about this stuff, because we think it's pretty interesting. Yeah. And also, I mean, as we were, looking at these spaces, we're thinking, well, Melbourne is full of these dense spaces as well. Maybe not as extensively, maybe not as consistently. So then the question is the role of planning cities to facilitate that intense habitation, or is it to control it and prevent it?
Yeah, I mean, there's a line in one of the interviews where someone says that, I think it might even be me, but why are we prepared to cram into a bar in a laneway on a milk crate, and then but live in a house with a fancy dining room that nobody ever uses, that sort of thing.
Or it's illegal to design an apartment less than 66
minutes. I guess it's really just picking at those questions.
I mean, it's ultimately a kind of cultural question, right? So it sounds to me as if it's not that we couldn't do it here because of the regulation or what have you. It might be a little bit more difficult, but perhaps there's no demand for it. So maybe...
There is, but I think some of our apartments it is possible to build very, very small apartments, or it was until fairly recently. But the question of demand is interesting, actually. You sound like you're about to answer that.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't think, I'm not sure we can say what people want, because I remember when people in Melbourne would say no one will live in a high rise, except of course the commission flats, and if you remember at Beckett Street.
15 years ago.
Yeah. And you could say, well, that's the international student population has really helped kick that along, and that's true. But a huge amount of our population has experienced cities that are unlike, Melbourne suburbs. So.
Yeah, I mean, the likes of Milieu or the Assemble guys are all, there is a certain percentage of the population that are, I would imagine, I think are right, but quite fully bought into the concept of the small footprint lifestyle and proximity as something that is a trade-off for kind of scale, I guess.
Well, I was going to say perhaps if we want these changes, it's less a question of designing for them and just making them desirable imaging, like Rob Adams has done with the and that's what Neo Metro has been very successful at. It's more or less what Nightingale's been successful with.
Yeah. Exactly.
Every time someone does one of those things, they inch the debate forward and just kind of prove that there's evidence that it's not a disaster. It's not going to turn into a slum. People are not going to have psychological problems as opposed to as a consequence.
Sorry guys, can I interject again?
Sure.
Just with these projects that you guys are sort of spitting out, I fully do agree and in alignment that they're also trying to push out these sort of concepts, but the difference between somewhere like Asia, where it is much more as a result of necessity, I don't think the average sort of first home buyer is ever going to be able to buy into Neo Metro. It's a very particular sort of class that they're actually marketing towards. In fact, it's almost as if it's that hipster effect. You're selling an ideal to a particular demographic.
Yeah, well, that's right. And there's a lot of complicated things to say to that. But given the housing affordability problem, if you actually gave people a choice, you can have this housing land package for this, or for half of this, you can have an apartment where you can walk to whatever. A lot of people are not really confronted with that option. They are confronted with people trying to max out their profit in a development. And I think also what you're getting at as well, there's probably a reticence about making very small dwellings, very low cost dwellings, because of the stigma attached to that and the history of commission flats and so on. And so there's been a lot of work trying to prove that apartments are not the domain of poor people. They're actually desirable.
Well, I mean,
and aspirational.
I mean, the whole family apartment. There was an article, I think it was in the Guardian on the weekend last week, about basically there's the percentage of 3-bedroom apartments in Sydney. I think it's less than 10% or something like that. So it also could just be a simple issue of providing stock that is fit for purpose, basically.
There was a great study about 10 years ago that the Grattan Institute did, which was giving people the housing that they need as opposed to the housing they necessarily want. Some spin on it was effectively that. But it was a survey, population survey, and most people would have chosen to live in a middle ring suburb and would be happy to give up the space of an outer ring house. They'd be happy to live in something closer to, say, like a Muse model or a townhouse model. If the trade-off was space, ultimately, proximity for them was more desirable than the space that you'd get out in Broadmeadows or wherever. But the problem, of course, is none of that land's being released. So even that level of, I mean, you wouldn't call it super tight density, is not really feasible.
But it is the same, it's the same logic that, we've more and more talked about tightening something rather than actually, it's not like you set up a blueprint for a super tight city, but it's like a process where cities tend to tighten as they get inhabited. So people work out ways to use space that's left over, or they get more people in the dwelling and all that sort of stuff. There's also that study that showed all those 2-bedroom apartments around the city that were housing way more than
2
the
people.
intended habitation. Hello.
Hi, can I ask a question about, the economic side of this, because I returned recently to Melbourne after living in Copenhagen, where most people are renting, it's normal to rent, and I think a lot of Europe and maybe Asia is a little the same. We're such a capitalist, property, paradigm down here. You've got to get on the ladder early on when you're young, buy an apartment, then scale up, get a bigger place, maybe in the suburbs, get yourself a garden, space for 2 cars, this whole sort of journey, economic sort of scale that we're trying to achieve, which is, I don't think, the norm in a lot of other countries where it's completely acceptable socially, economically, whatever status arguments you want to make, to just rent your whole life. So I think that maybe could be a force where that's another thing that I kind of wonder about in Australia, about shifting this attitude towards.
What was the quality of the rental accommodation like for you? Yeah.
Amazing. And it's like you don't feel look, it's hard to untangle the fact that it's a socialist democracy, and people have,
and there's rent control and
a little bit, and yes, there's the whole sector of housing that's.
Do you have the same kind of calibre of rental accommodation available here to you now?
No.
Yeah.
Such an interesting question. And it's not really one we deal with, but it came up a lot in the discussions during the bar talks and the exhibition. And I mean, it's that whole debate is flaring up right now, and politically it's really tricky because it's amazing how much of our sort of, if you like, our economic system is built on home ownership, and people have described the demise of the Liberal Party as correlated with the demise of home ownership, because that idea that you, as you say, you plant your roots and build a house and blah, 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 become an owner and ratepayer and all that sort of stuff shapes your view of the world.
I just worry that that's another challenge to overcome in terms of shifting people's attitudes and driving the perceived value of a small apartment, because it's a great way to live, but if you feel as though you've got to be on this capitalist trajectory where you own a larger piece of land and that's the only way to get ahead, then I think that's a problem for architects, interior designers, and people that are trying to advocate for smaller footprint living and trying to create the idea that that's actually an excellent way to live. And
the one that you might buy into for yourself.
Right,
That's
maybe
really cool.
maybe you just rent it forever, that's also fine.
So do you think that capitalist mindset could actually be applied onto different build forms? Like a lot of people look at property period as a investment class, right? Like as an asset class. Full disclosure, I work in property, so I see this all the time, but people's mindsets towards it, they don't even differentiate between whether or not it's a house and land. People gladly go out and buy different sort of apartments as long as it returns them a certain yield. So in that sense, in designing those sort of spaces, it still pushes that agenda, but you'd also have that capitalistic mindset being pushed down as well.
I think your point that there's a sort of an ambivalence there, because the renting thing's important, but so much. There's been a lot of discussion about the fact that a lot of the stock that you're describing hasn't been built for owner-occupiers, and things might change if that were the case. They were built as investments, and the assumption that it's a transient sort of person renting it and so on.
Yeah, I guess my point is just that, and maybe it was mentioned earlier in the conversation, but I just see that there's a communications issue here, like a PR issue with small, living in small places. And it's connected to, unfortunately, this the collective sort of mostly capitalist ideology that Australia has, and that it might be nice to just sort of argue for the fact that it's completely fine to live in a tiny apartment until you're 80 years old. You don't have to get yourself, do better and get a bigger space. And that's not where the value is. The value is the quality of living that you have, and in whatever size it is.
To the point about the finance, though, I mean, my experience, and I'm not sure if this is something that's shared by everybody, but having been in the property market, or tried to get into the property market for a long time, for over a decade, early on what I found was banks won't loan for certain kinds of apartments. Once you get below a certain scale, they will not do that. And one of the big challenges for Nightingale, I don't know if everyone's familiar with Nightingale, but it's an architect-led development model ultimately, where it's sort of small amount of profit. There's a ceiling on how much profit they can make. It's supposed to be a bit more of an affordable option. One of the big challenges for them wasn't the design, but the financing, because banks wouldn't loan.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of educating to happen there as well, I suspect.
Yeah, there's been a lot discussed about that. And how much that is genuine financial risk, or just a kind of a intuitive bias against that sort of stuff.
Well, I think in the case of that, there was probably very legitimate grounds for not lending on unlivable apartments, which were, not that the Nightingale ones aren't, but generally speaking, it was sort of, they were classified in with a lot of really bad stock that was just designed as the minimum possible, there was a lot of problems associated with tiny apartments that were unsellable at that time.
Yeah.
And it just unfortunately got lumped in with it, I think.
Well, they just needed a cut and dry way of determining whether or not something was viable.
Yeah,
and I think
as an architect, we have a lot of difficulty dealing with banks who won't lend on architect-administered contracts, because they don't. There's an architect involved in kind of assessing the value.
I don't think you guys can do the math.
I think it's just a certainty thing as well. Like a lot of that trepidation financing stuff was that there wasn't a long track record of it. Banks have been lending, houses on blocks of land for decades. But it was particularly when, buying houses, dwellings under 50 square metres came onto the market. Like, what do we do with this? What's it going to worth? Like, we've got no idea what it's going to be worth in 10 years because there's no precedent.
Yeah.
I think that takes time.
Matt, just to add to that point, I think it's also the motivation for the purchase as well. So you're never going to be able to stop a financier from looking at property as an asset class. Whereas a Nightingale purchaser will actually look to live, and that's a different motivation to purchase.
Yeah, they're looking for a home ultimately.
Maybe one of the kind of communal financing models are. This is one of the things that came up at the RISC, it's probably almost 10 years ago, the conference that Hamish Lyon, Don Bates and...
you're probably right. Yeah, it was about 10 years ago.
So there was a person out from the Singapore Housing Board who talked about the idea, the difference between the strata model and the corporate model, where you own a share of a collective rather than an individual strata title. And so this idea of kind of buying into a collective financial arrangement, similar to Bauergruppen and sort of collective housing models, probably sidesteps that issue of kind of defining the asset class of a particular unit, because you're lending on a building which might have been more than the sum of its parts. Although we are really getting a long way from...
Well, I was going to say, it's really fascinating. Almost every single time we have these conversations, ends up talking about apartments and buying stuff.
Yeah, we're talking about residential
and
property.
we've got almost nothing to say about that. It's all about public
we have been
space,
talking a lot
streets, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah,
It's really interesting, but it always comes back to that. We're having this conversation in Vietnam. I don't reckon that will be the case.
It is part of the Australian culture, unfortunately.
It does really change the debate, though, because if you've got, you know, my apartment in Ho Chi Minh City had the most, you know, amazing little lane just downstairs, and so there's nothing wrong with my apartment, but it mattered less, and I certainly had less to say about it, whether I was renting it or buying it. Who cares? Because I spent less and less time in there because the public life is so astonishingly good.
I mean, one thing I would say in the issue of the housing ladder. I mean, what we could argue for that there's a lesson out of this book is the concept of adaptability and change. Like, I mean, if you look at the sort of lifespan of of how you might kind of, you know, it might be not practical to live in a small apartment from the age of 20 to 80, but it could be practical to live in an apartment that is, you know, can connect to the one next door, or that it forms part of a kind of, you know, there is the capacity for it to evolve and kind of change in time. And part of the reason why big houses are kind of desirable for people is that there is the latent fat or kind of looseness within them to absorb huge amounts of change. You can start as a couple, have 5 kids, and then they can all go, and it really doesn't matter. And so that's why it sort of feels like a safe option. But if we perhaps, rather than thinking of a very simple way of planning for uncertainty, we might actually think of a more kind of sophisticated way, then perhaps that doesn't sidestep the issues of the market, but it certainly it offers a role that designers might actually contribute into it.
We're actually over time, guys, so thank you everyone for coming. And we obviously have a few books here available for sale if you're keen to grab a copy. There's a lot in it, a lot more than we've talked about tonight. And of course, Hope Street Radio next door if you fancy a wine, and there's a great rooftop bar. This is a super tight precinct.
Yeah.
Super tight precinct. Please join me in thanking our speakers.
Thank you for coming.